Oh, great. Thank you for that, Kathleen. So we're looking forward to a fabulous part 2 of 2 on unraveling bias with our guest speaker, mediator and arbitrator, Denise Peterson. As you may recall from the last segment, or if you're brand new, she's licensed in New York and Texas and has extensive experience arbitrating through FINRA and as a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, but a large proportion of her practice is actually mediations, as I learned last time. And so she does a fair amount of trainings as well, including trainings on the topic of implicit bias as relates to and intersects with human decision-making and mediation in ADR. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it right back over to Denise Peterson.
Hi, and I guess it's actually technically afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for making time to be here today. This is, if you were here with me last time, you know that I really welcome comments and I really welcome open discussion as we go through items. And I was sort of throwing a couple of questions out at various points, more than I did last time, because we're going to be sort of walking through how implicit bias and human decision-making kind of create outcomes. And as we do that, I will definitely be looking for feedback from everybody. And you're welcome to either use the Q&A format or you can use the chat. I have both windows up, and my moderators, Lydia and Kathleen, are going to be also letting me know if I missed somebody's comment. So please feel welcome to do that. I can't emphasize that enough, because this is, as much as we're doing it remotely and with a larger group than we normally would for purposes of a collaborative discussion, is still a collaborative discussion. So let me get my screen share going here. I did actually have a few more slides this time. Okay, so let's see if this is working right. It appears to be. My chat always disappears when I do this. I got to reopen it. There we go. So I don't lose it completely. Tech. All right. And if the slides end up with, there we go. So we're going to talk today about the following. We're going to talk about the impact of implicit biases on human decision-making and the problems that they can cause. And we're actually going to start off with a very recent, as in like it's still exploding right now, issue where this is happening. We're going to look at some demographics and real-world examples, and we'll look at a project at the end that has some incredibly positive results, and I think can actually be used as an organizational model for addressing change. And we'll wrap up with a Q&A session. I will definitely be reserving time for that. So, a couple of things though. There will be some pictures today that include some nudity, but only of adults. There will be some discussion about race, gender, and sexual abuse or sexual exploitation of minors. And it's going to be in the first 10 minutes. So I'm letting you all know, if you have issues in those areas, please be aware that those are going to be discussed today. All right, let's get to it. Let's talk about Lensa, the new AI app that is rocking through social media. And is creating a firestorm, not just in intellectual property areas, and not just with issues with artists. There's a whole lot legally going on in that space, but because it is actually a perfect example of what happens when these sources, by the way, I linked sources all the way through so you guys can go back and get the presentation later and look at some of the articles and information that I was looking at. I used more resources than the ones just listed for everything. However, I wanted to make sure I had at least a couple linked in. So Lensa, everyone's little portraits on their web pages are all changing. It's all these cool uploads. And Lensa was written by programmers. And one of the things that happens when you program and you do something over time is you're going to have some unaccounted for effects. So let's talk about that. So women who are uploading their pictures onto Lensa, and usually they're just like headshot photos, are finding when Lensa provides them pictures that are generated that are bigger, that suddenly they're bigger and smaller at the same time. Clothes are disappearing. Some pictures are actually completely topless. I did not include those. But here are 4 examples that I literally pulled off of Twitter this morning. where the people who had uploaded these pictures had uploaded them and they were just from here up. So when Lenza decided, the program ran and created the bodies, they created bodies that were chest heavy, scantily clad, body conscious clothing, very revealing, very sexualized. You know, some people were okay with that, but a lot of people were kind of like, this is not what I was looking for. And one of the dangers here is the fact that Lenza, by its own terms and conditions, not only owns the pictures that were originally uploaded, but also owns the ones that were created. If you think about that lawyer for a minute, you can see where that goes. Now, what we have here is an example of probably one programmer's or several programmers' preference for amount of skin to clothing that got amplified. Their bias, their preference got amplified, and here's the outcome from it. And we see this in a lot of other spaces, but I wanted to start with this one because this is the one that's currently getting discussed, and I think it was even on one of the morning talk shows today. I don't know if it was Good Morning America or one of the other ones. And, oh, sorry, here's the other part of it that's bad. And I don't have any images of this, but I'm going to add this here and I'm going to ask a question for y'all. People who are uploading pictures of their kids, those pictures are also getting sexualized. And I'm obviously, for obvious reasons, not going to show you any, but the pictures of kids are being, basically it's borderline, if not cross-line, to creation of child pornography through the AI, which is probably in some ways a discussion for a different class, but you can see how a small preference or a small bias can amplify and become something that's a much, much more major issue. And just out of curiosity, how many of you have actually looked at Lenza or heard about this before today? Just, you know, you can either do a raise hand or just say, you know, you'd heard about some of this, or you thought about some of this, or you'd uploaded it and kind of noticed it yourself. Okay. Yeah, and one thing that's interesting is the men that are uploading the pictures that are literally shirtless, they're actually coming back with more clothes on. So I thought that was an interesting flip side, at least from the anecdotal evidence that we have been seeing. And obviously this is a new enough product that was released within the past couple of weeks, apparently this new version of it, that I don't have data on the level of like a scientific study, but it is a good example. Here's some other examples where this happens. I'm gonna change this to the definition page because I'm tired of looking at this. Issues where programmers' preferences or own internal biases can affect outcomes happen every day. And one really good example is my husband, who's a game programmer, who used to work for a large company that had an issue because the human resources program that they were using to upload everyone into the database required all last names to be at least 3 letters, which created a problem if you were, for example, Chinese or Korean and you had an LI or an LE last name, just to name 2 potential issues. Other issues have been where if you have a Hispanic last name with multiple last names, not sufficient letters available to put a whole name in there. And that actually has an issue here locally in Harris County, where we have a deep Mexican-American roots here, and ownership records, property records that go back 150 years. The computer program that was used to convert them, let's just say it's very, very hard to find anybody. And oh, Jay, the spelling of Lenza is L-E-N-S-A, Lenza. So if you guys go out there, Google, or you go to Twitter and you type in Lenza Newt, you'll see all kinds of information popping up. And that's why I gave some of the links to the articles as well. So what is an implicit bias and how does it intersect with what I was just talking about? Good question. So first of all, as a reminder from last week, an implicit bias is an attitude or stereotype that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. And the unconscious is really important. It's not an explicit choice. Like I'm going to use the colors on the website for my favorite sports team. That's a bias towards your sports team, and it's an explicit bias towards your sports team, and it's a specific choice that's being made. But rather, it is the reflexive reaction or reflexive filtering of information through a particular lens, and we'll talk more about that in a second. And one thing to understand is all of us have a default state, a default sort of set of definitions that we filter things through. And it's important because that's sort of how we get through the world. If we don't filter some of our data in some sort of order, the world will become overwhelming. And that starts off with our personal in-groups. It's finally working this time. So to touch back on this again, in-groups developed as part of our, if you will, brain's programming, because we were hunter-gatherers. And as hunter-gatherers, we worked in small groups cooperatively inside of our group to manage resources, take care of young, go hunting, go fishing, protect small plots of land that we were starting to do initial cultivation on. And our in-group meant safety and survival for us as a group. Other groups or individuals approaching or intersecting with our group were automatically perceptually seen as a threat because they could endanger the resources that we had access to. And because of limited resources, preferences became towards protecting our in-group and immediately seeing anybody who was not part of our in-group as other. And when you have somebody that's an other or a group that's an other, you don't think about it. You don't include it in your calculus. You don't include it in your analysis. It is sort of quietly excluded. Oh, okay. I didn't mean for there to be transitions like this. I guess PowerPoint's doing them all fancy for me now on my own. All right. So this is where we get into amplify and amplification, which are two terms that I use and I hear you and get used in academia about this. So when you have an implicit bias, it gets amplified, and it gets amplified by, well, sort of like if you have a small pebble starting an avalanche. One small choice can have a lot of choices down the road, and those small choices don't get derailed the way maybe you could derail an avalanche by having some bypasses or other things in place to kind of like move things away or protect areas. If your own in-group all carries the same type of biases or preferences, so there's no questioning of them. And we tell that the amplification happens through something I call the lens. It's the lens. So the lens amplifies it. The important way to find out how to deal with this is to figure out what the lens is that's affecting or creating the amplification effect. So in this particular case, if we go back to Lensa, I think it's fairly safe to say that somewhere up in line, one of the programmer's pebbles that started the later avalanche was for less clothing and larger chests on women. And so that affected the way he programmed stuff. If the group that he's working with, including his senior programmers and his quality control people, also carry similar preferences, no one's questioning it. That's the lens through which the amplification happens. And it gets amplified because it gets used thousands and thousands and millions of times. And suddenly we have an endemic of these photos. Or we have an issue with the HR database where you have an international company that was doing great when it was just in the US, but say they merged with a company that was based in Southeast Asia, and suddenly they can't get the database to work with a significant number of their employees' names. And then you get bad outcomes that come from that. People are like, well, we'll just make it like, we'll make it lead, but we'll add like 1 or 3, we'll add numbers afterwards. We'll add numbers afterwards to differentiate them, which no one wants to be referred to by a number. And that becomes a negative outcome because it's like, you know, you're like part of an employee group that's like, you know, Lee 1, Lee 2, Lee 3, Lee 4, Lee 5, and yet most of the Anglo-Saxon rooted names don't have numbers after them because there's more variation in the name, last name systems. It becomes an issue. So there we go. All right, so let's talk about the lenses of being an attorney in California. And first of all, I want to commend you before you think I'm picking on California, because I am living in Texas, all right? One, I was born in South Los Angeles. My family is all still in from LA to San Diego, and my uncle owns a shop on Melrose. So I'm not picking on California, giving you my own biases here. And you're actually doing better than Texas in some areas. So I'll tell you about that. But let's look at the differences between the demographics of the state of California and the actual Bar of California. And this is from your own bar's report that came out in 2022, I think May. So under race, the state of California is 39% white. The bar is 66% white. The state is 36% Latino or Hispanic. The bar is 6%. Asian, 16 and 14. Black or African American, 6 and 3. American Indian, Alaska Native, 0.4 or 0.2. Middle Eastern or North African, 3% and 3%. And multiracials, the people who identify as being belonging to more than one racial demographic group, 2% for the California population, 8% for the attorneys. And we're going to pop over to the other category. So in the California population, you are 49% male, 51% female. It's about the national average right there. And your bar is 55% male and 44% female, with 1% being recognizing, listing themselves as non-binary. By comparison, the State Bar of Texas is 64% male and 78% white. So, like I said, you guys are doing a lot better than we are. They did do some good additional analysis in the report I was looking at, so I wanted to sort of include this in here, which is the intersection of race and gender, because the race and gender is going to come up a little bit later when I'm talking about some work and studies that the ABA has been doing. First of all, 0.3% are non-binary attorneys of color, and 18% of your bar is women of color, 16% are men of color, 0.4% are white non-binary attorneys, 26% are white women, and 40% are white men. So if you have decisions that are being made as a majority, right, then you've got 66% of the bar is white, and 55% of the bar is male. So we have traditionally excluded demographics who are staying in sort of those lines. And in Texas, for example, I wasn't able to get some of the historical demographic data, but looking at Texas as a potential model, because we have 100,000 attorneys in the state of Texas, or rather 100,000 people who are licensed in Texas, rather. Our numbers haven't shifted all that great in the past 20 years. You know, they're improving, but they're not necessarily improving at a rate that is going to make a significant change within my kids' generation. So one of the ways we can talk about this is looking from the leadership on down. All right, and I'm not picking on, if any of you are on this particular skilly, I'm not picking on you, I promise. But one of the places I always start looking is, who's my leadership? Okay, who are the lenses that decisions are being made through? And what are the potential amplifications on the downstream? So, and this is just some assumptions based off the names, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 or 9 men in that group for officers, right? So even more of a split than you would see in your actual demographics. Once again, just going off the names, it looks like there is some multiple racial representation. But if there's a vote off of pure majority and the lens is male, what is the impact to female on those types of decisions? And that comes into play right now, especially, we'll talk about this more in a minute, with what's happening with women in the law and retention of women in the law. Excuse me, I keep losing my voice today. Does anyone have any questions or comments so far? Does the information about implicit bias, about how we look at the amplification of implicit bias through the lens of what the potential bias could be affecting a particular group? We know we have a problem, right? But the problem is, and like I said, and it is across the United States. There's not a single state in the United States where we do not have this issue of bias towards white and male in the legal profession. It has overwhelmingly been our history, because it was the practice of law. It was only open to men There's an entire Supreme Court case in the 1880s that said women don't have a right to practice law if the state doesn't want to give it to them. And women, minorities, it's all the way down the line. So we know we've got this problem. We have to look at what the lenses are that are continuing to prevent the problem from being resolved. So there's a generic default is a term that gets used, and I like the term. The generic default in Western society, which America's part of, I apologize, I still have the pulled muscle in my hip, so sitting hurts. So if you see me moving around, that's why. Is the generic default for our bars is male and white. That is the majority default. And when you have a generic default, people are more likely to believe a profession is male dominated or white dominated, which results in male candidates for jobs and political appointments being more frequently put forward than any other of the other groups. Information on these studies comes out of Invisible Woman, which I cannot recommend enough if you have not looked at it or read the book. Also Homo Sapiens and Homo Sapiens is also another fabulous book, as well as Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things, what categories tell you about the mind. So here's a question for y'all. Has America ever won the World Cup? I'm definitely gonna be waiting for answers in the chat on this one. Has America ever won the World Cup? American women's team has won 4 times. America has won the World Cup 4 times. It's 4, not 5. It's 4 times. I'm going to play again this coming summer. The lens is the assumption that America playing the World Cup is the men's team. That's when you have a generic default impact. What does a computer gamer look like? Howard, I will answer your question in a second. I did talk about this in the last presentation, but I will answer that question in a second. What does a computer gamer look like? So the answers I'm seeing, young man, white young male. Yeah, it's kind of like there's like some with a headset playing Call of Duty, hunched up, right? Teenager. I've been a computer gamer since 1991. I've been playing computer games online computer gamers specifically since 1991. Technically gaming since the Atari 2600 came out. But my experience has always been that when people talk about computer gamers as a group, they talk about young men in their teens, men in their 20s, playing games like Call of Duty and equivalents, and discussions tend to center around that as being the majority of what gamers are, which really is not true if you look at the actual. Okay, so Howard, he says, Howard's comment, it's a good one, by the way. It's a good, because he's right. Implicit in my statements are the race and gender legal profession should reflect the race and general of the community, of the general population. Yes, absolutely. We as members of the bar, as officers of the bar, have a duty to serve the populations of our state. We are officers of the court and we are sworn to serve. So yes, we need to be able to understand and interact with the demographics that work with us, that we work with, that come to us. And it's not saying that you're automatically wrong or bad or anything if you are male or white in the legal profession. What it's saying is you are not going to see or understand some things because you don't have the background or history or life experience that matches everybody. Now, nobody does, okay? Nobody's that omniscient, but the more uniform your group is, the less you're going to be able to understand experiences or shared experiences because you're not going to hear about it from other people in your group. Let me give you an example. I had just started out as a member of the Association of Attorney Mediators. This was back before COVID, and we had met together in person for a big conference up in Dallas. We were out at dinner with everybody, and this mediator, a younger guy in his 40s, which tells you how old I am. I'm talking younger guy in his 40s, there's my bias, is talking about how he had this case where women's kitchen had flooded because the dishwasher had gotten plugged up. And he settled the case, he settled for a good amount of money. But he was telling us he was so confused at why they were willing, the defense was willing to put the money on the table, okay? And I said, well, what was the cause of the clog? And what was the cause? And he goes, well, she was washing tin foil in the upper rack of the dishwasher. And eventually some got down into the drains and everything else and caused a problem. And, you know, and the whole place flooded. And someone down the table from me goes, just out of curiosity, like, did you kind of grow up like in a sort of middle-class background? Yeah. She's like, oh yeah. How long have your family, I love these questions that they ask. How long had your family, did your parents own a house? Yeah. Did your grandparents own a house? They said, yeah, okay. They said, so you don't have poverty in your background. And, or maybe you're not, you know, from an area, your family's not from an area where certain resources weren't available. Tin foil is a luxury. And my grandmother did this too. Oh God, I had to learn how to re-roll, clean and re-roll, use tinfoil to use it again, because she was a child of the Great Depression. Because his background and experience as being middle class and no immigration recently in his family and not really impacted by the Great Depression, at least the stories did not come down from it. He lacked the information and exposure to be able to understand an issue arising out in this case, out of this woman's history of poverty. So, Jeffrey, do I assume that numbers always equate to prejudice? No, I'm not even talking about prejudice. I'm talking about implicit bias. And it is, as we discussed last week, hard to, when you have an unconscious reaction to information, it's hard to narrow it down, but we've shown it scientifically in studies that we do actually actively make choices that favor our in-groups. And if our in-groups are overwhelmingly white and male, then the choices that we're making are going to conform in that space. So it's not prejudice, it's just bad habits we got to break, okay? We've got to look at how we're thinking at things, how it's affecting us and our decision-making, how it's affecting our clients and things that are going on around in the world around them, so that we can do better as lawyers, as a profession, and as lawyers to our clients. And Andrew, I wish that the answer to that is yes to what you said. He said, well, with the men's team in progress, that's why everyone gave the answer to the men's team. What would happen if I said the women's team? If the women's team got the kind of coverage that the men's team did, I think the answer would maybe be what you think it is. But I actually did ask this question back when the women's team was last playing. And I got a lot of, there's a women's team. So unfortunately, that's not the case. The coverage of women's sports and the equality of women's sports is a fundamental disparate impact situation. Okay, so here's another one for you guys. Who argues in front of the Supreme Court? I mean, besides the lawyers. If you close your eyes and you imagine somebody arguing in front of the Supreme Court. Okay, Jay, good safe answer. Solicitor General and outside lawyers. Andrew, you're funny. I like you. Okay, let's take a look at that. So Minnesota, Sam, we're looking at other states too. Looked at their 2019-2020 Minnesota Supreme Court term. I tried to find if they'd done an updated article, upgraded demographics. I was not able to get it in the time of last week where I was trying to update this presentation. So it's a little bit older, but like not that much. So 176 oral arguments. 176. Women argued 52 times. Of those 52, 37 were government lawyers, which means private practice in Minnesota, private practice, women are not getting the opportunity to argue in front of the highest court in their state. And they followed that up. Only 14 of the 95 arguments by private practitioners, they went back and looked at all the private practitioners, right? Only 14 of the 95 oral arguments by private practitioners were women. So, all right, well, that's okay. Minnesota, that's Minnesota. They're cool. Maybe it's because it's cold up there, right? Could be something. So let's look at the United States Supreme Court. This is term ending May 2020. So I'm checking my time here. So 136 oral arguments made by men, 20 by women. Of those 20, 12 were in government or academia, and 11 were, and so there's one case where there's sometimes you have overlap, you have more than one person doing the argument. So, and 11 of them were women from private practice. So what's the lens here? What's being amplified? Well, it could be several things. Do I have that slide still? Okay, no. It's sort of like, okay. So I evidently accidentally deleted the slide I thought was still there. So let me stick around with this for a second. What are some of the factors that could drive this? First of all, we like to repeat a winning formula. If so-and-so is won before in front of the Supreme Court, I want to use him again, because this is not the time for us to be taking chances, right? Right, yeah, no, we don't want to mess around. Second, our client may have a preference, although that's changing because especially the larger clients or industrial clients are pushing, saying we want to see diverse groups representing us on the law firm side to match our diversity goals for our organization. So that's changing a little bit. But I hear a lot of that's kind of how we've always done it. This is always what so it's always been. And oh no, Jeffrey, you get to make your solutions. I don't have the answers to everything. I just ask a lot of questions. I'm a mediator, remember? Parties get to make the decisions. I just give you the information. All right, if I can get this to work. Okay, so I had just got emailed to me last week. There's a 2021 report from the ABA that goes really granular on the appellate practice specifically and women's roles in it. It's a great read. I did not want to spend 3 hours on this one thing because I think that that particular report in there is very, very revealing about some of the issues. But it goes farther than that, because one of our issues is, oh, I did put some of this in here. One of the issues that we're dealing with is the retention of women in the law in general, okay, across all factors and issues. So some of the ones I'd already mentioned is issues that are barriers to change, are the implicit biases, client expectations, repeating successful formula, being a first-generation attorney. One of the biggest issues, especially in traditionally excluded demographics, into building successful practices and access to the top-tier law firms as a potential associate, is because they don't have a family member or close family friend who's a lawyer. So they're coming into the practice of law without knowing all the little bits and pieces and social cues and social mores and things that are expected of first-generation attorneys. And to make Mr. Kravitz happy this time, I will tell you one of the things we've got with our Houston Young Lawyers Association is Zachary Caballero and a couple of other young attorneys created a first-generation attorney work group. So this is a group that gets together and helps to bridge the gap of understanding how to network, how to get a historical understanding of law practice that you don't necessarily have if you're coming into it without anyone in your family having practiced law. And I actually respect that because I was the first person in my family to practice law. In fact, my dad famously hated lawyers. So he didn't even have friends who were lawyers that I could ever go ask and question to. So that was a crazy one. Being the primary breadwinner, that will be more important in a minute. Being a parent, and the biggest one, It's the lack of access to the places where decisions are being made. If you look at, oh, I don't know, the equity partners, the major law firms in the United States, only 2% of them are women of color. It hasn't changed in 20 years. Is their knowledge, experience, and background being used to understand the lenses that are amplifying biases into actual problems in their firm or potentially for their clients? Probably not. And I can say that with some confidence. And here's some links to articles I'm about to talk about. This is, that talk about the reason women want to leave the practice of law. All right. And one of the articles opens with that 70% of women of color are thinking about actively leaving the practice of law. Why would they want to do that? If you work so hard to get into law, and these days, the debt that you have to take on to do it, right? You know, it's gone are the days of I've got some friends that graduated in the 90s, and they're like, yeah, I paid till $40,000 for law school. And I'm like, oh God, I wish I'd only had to pay that much. I went to law school much later. So there's some articles here for you. But, and one of the things I hear all the time is more women are graduating law school than men, more women are passing the bar proportionally than men. So isn't this going to be a self-fixing problem? And it's not. And it's not because of where the decisions are being made. And let's just look at some potential places where these amplified issues are happening. Firm policies, and these are generalization statements. I'm not picking on any one particular firm at all. And I do have a big firm background. I worked at Morgan Lewis, and I loved that firm. It was a great firm. And I worked at Morgan Lewis with toddlers. So I have some background in like understanding the complications of being a single parent at a law firm. But they tend to favor what the majority of our equity partners look like, who tend to be male, the primary breadwinner, okay, for the family. And because you're an equity partner, tend to be an issue. And I'm Joanne and Jay and Melanie, I'm seeing your comments. The policies tend to disfavor those who provide child or elder care. And by disfavor, we're talking about billable hour requirements, mandated time in the office, mandated face time with clients, rigid structures that don't allow flexibility. Now, most of our studies around this, I will say as a caveat, are pre-COVID. COVID is, and the impact of being able to do things remotely is changing considerations, but some of the bigger places are trying to revert back to pre-COVID policies and approaches. So we may have some backsliding on some of the improvements that have happened. They tend to disfavor those who use medical leave for any purpose, whether it is for pregnancy, whether it is for cancer treatment, any of that. Those life choices derail them off of partner tracks. They derail them off of associate retention. They're seen as a negative by not putting the firm first as a place and a requirement to be. They tend to not have new parent leave, or those that do require a return to work period that's way too short. Like, have your kid, have your kid, enjoy them for 2 weeks and we'll see you then. They don't support breastfeeding parents. And if you are breastfeeding and you need to pump, you need space. One thing I will say that I'm proud of, and I think that you've had something similar in the Los Angeles area, but here in Harris County, which is where Houston's seated, one of our judges now has made sure that, at least in our civil courthouses, we now have safe, secure locations for people to pump. And they also have policies about taking breaks at trial to ensure that that could happen, which I think is phenomenal. They lack opportunities to stay on partner tracks, the flex or part-time arrangement. If you want to go part-time for a few years as a parent, to be there with the child before the school years, or because there may be even for any other reasons, or you've got an elder parent that requires care, but they're living with you and they're not in a nursing home, going part-time or flex time ends opportunities for advancement, ends that path overwhelmingly. And just like I said before, lack support for remote work, mixed bag now with, with COVID. So, these are the problems. And when the people who are making the decisions are from the top, overwhelmingly out of one group, where none of these issues are ones that have affected them in their daily lives, they're not necessarily going to think about it. Which is why when you have groups making decisions for things like policies, procedures, HR procedures, you want to have everybody from all levels to buy in, to give feedback, to explain where problems is, and to create opportunities for change. Now, I did hear somebody say that they wanted to hear a solution. I'm going to give you one. And I'm going to give you one of the most conservative groups out there, United States military. In the 1940s, the United States military created their dress codes. Specifically, we're going to talk about the Air Force. And they created this in 1946, 47, somewhere in there, they created their initial dress codes, most of which have not changed in that intervening 60 plus years. Which means that for women serving in the United States Air Force, that meant that their dress standards were based at a time, where lipstick was still considered a little scandalous. And where grooming and maintenance standards were, very different from where we are today. Now, when we're dealing with the military, there's also a lot of other considerations we have to do. There has to be issues about understanding grooming standards, cleanliness, combat readiness, operational success. All of things are critical issues that do need to be addressed and dealt with. And they affect every kind of decision. So, but we know where the dress code started, okay? We know they were based on primarily, because it was primarily extended in waves. It would have been a women Air Force, waves, not wax. I've got family members that were in both groups. Was based on what those standards were in the 1940s, which did not include a multiracial Air Force. And the Air Force recognizes its diversity these days. So a group got together a few years back and started what was called Operation Warrior Braids. And I'm very privileged that one of my law school classmates was actually in Operation Warrior Braids, which is how I heard about this. Dateline, February 10th, 2021. The United States Air Force changed their policies on hair to incorporate styles that were more inclusive of different types of hair and grooming standards that still supported all the requirements of the military. It took years of work. How did they do it? And I do have a link, by the way, to a couple of things, so you can go follow up on this. It was an all-volunteer group in this particular case. And I point this out because for organizations that are for-profit, if you are going to launch this kind of initiatives, please make sure that it's either part of the compensation package or make sure that there is appropriate recognition advancement that compensates for this extra work on top of all of our billing hour requirements, okay? Pay people for the work that they do to create change. They did extensive research on safety issues, medical and operational aspects. They did qualitative and quantitative surveys of groups and bases around the world, from the individuals who are serving all the way up through base commands. And they built alliances to create support. What can we learn from this initiative? I loved this because I think I'm going to steal it and keep it forever as the problems with trying to address change in any organization, any group, any culture. You're going to have three sets of people, okay? You're going to have people who complain, people who critique, or those who are ready to continue, all right? And for complain, well, I'll be honest, there's always going to be complaints, all right? I was talking a little while back with a group, and I was explaining that one of the drags, and it's a statistical drag on the change of our demographics in the bars. We don't have a mandatory retirement age. So you have people who are practicing in their 70s, 80s, and even 90s, right? Well, that group, those groups more overwhelmingly are white and male statistically. So that creates sort of a drag on the numbers. And I was told I was ageist. And I was like, no, I'm just, I'm just telling you, like, that's the numbers. It's where, some of the drag on the change is coming from, which means we do need to look at what's in coming years. So there'll always be somebody who will complain, and that's okay. I think critics tend to be a large group, and there's a lot of opportunity here to actually use the criticism in good ways. With critics, identify the source of their criticisms. Did they feel left out of the process? One of the reasons the Operation Warrior Braids was so successful is those alliances they built along the way that made sure they got participatory input, even if the input was not later part of the decision, right? At least people got their voices heard about the potential impact. Did they feel that their impact had an unintentional consequence? That happens, and we have to listen for those. Sometimes it happens in ways we, my favorite unintended consequence explanation is in Texas a few years back, the FLDS, Fundamental Latter-day Saints, the splinter group with the multiple wives, decided to camp out in North Texas, and our legislature freaked out. And one of the things that they did was they passed a law that made specifically sex between first cousins illegal. The unintended consequences is a state with a high number of immigration, and this was true for your white-based Europeans up until about 100 years ago, was first cousin marriages are not actually all that uncommon. Not uncommon, especially if you come from a farming culture, because if you don't keep land as the primary inheritance item inside the family, it's divided up too small to the point where it's not able to support anybody, right? So basically, the unintended consequence of the knee-jerk reaction to the FLDS was that they made 10,000 marriages in Texas potentially illegal. As a footnote, I don't think it was ever any prosecution underneath that, but it's still on the books. So it is important to listen to critics, even if it seems to come from a very negative space and you feel defensive about what you're trying to initiate, because there are sometimes unintended consequences out there that we have to be able to address, and our critics are our best sources for finding some of that information out. And can the criticism in future, as the change evolves, be incorporated in a way to help create more alliances and impact? Ultimately, when we know it's and so the last group, of course, those who want to continue, those are usually the people who are either positively affects them or to positively affect somebody in their in-group, and they become part of the energy to continue with change. I'm going to respond to some of these comments and open it for questions in a second, but I want to show you, I love this picture. This is the picture, this is the official Air Force updated female grooming standards picture to show how they've addressed it. They've addressed the hairstyles, hair differences, and your hair's different consistency, colors. I mean, I have got like the thinnest, flattest hair on the planet. And the only reason it's even like sort of braids, I've got a curl, is I got this cowlick up here. But so I have no idea what it's like to have thick or coarse hair, or the challenges to managing that. So I can do nothing but applaud this particular work, but especially the way it was done, I think is a case study in addressing change in organizations, and I've got the links for it. Hang on. All right, so there's the links right there. And now we are open to questions. Let me just zhuzh back here a little bit, because I think I saw some. Okay. All right, let's start with Jay. Okay, so concern. So Jay, I'm going to challenge you this only because, and admittedly, I'm in a blue county in a deeply red state, which is sometimes a little bit on the weird side. But our judges here have been some of the biggest leaders for change. Judge Ravi Santil is the one that first was one of the first to implement a family leave policy in his courts. He says, I don't care if you are the dad or the mom, you've given birth or you're adopting, it's a trial reset. And I will say there's a difference between state and federal too. Like I think if you're talking about like federal and state, there's kind of, federal is definitely still a lot more conservative. But I've got blue hair, and I show up in front of judges. They don't have a problem with it. Actually, they like it, and they've asked me. Some people have asked me who my hairstylist is. So it was scandalous when I first started working in corporate for me to not wear nylons. I couldn't even tell you where to buy them today. And so there is change. Your last part of it, there is change. And as our styles change too, that also drives some of the change. Like in COVID, once again, interesting impacts. Like we get away with really nice tops, right? And you have no idea what I'm wearing on the bottom. In fact, there's a judge, and I tease him about this all the time, Judge Woolridge, who's retired and does mediations. When he's at the offices at the Texas Justice Center, he's wearing a suit top and he's wearing board shorts on the bottom. So yes, judges can change. But on the judicial level, it's a split sort of thing. On the state level, I'm seeing a lot of initiatives to discuss implicit bias, addressing implicit bias in jury instructions. There's all these initiatives from the ABA on down. Last week, when I talked about the post-Booker study that was done in 2017, which is the last time it was done, the federal judges overwhelmingly freaked out, being called out on the fact that sentencing was overwhelmingly negatively impacting Black male defendants. So it's not, Jay, it's like a whole hour we could have a discussion about this. There are definitely initiatives. There's definitely improvements. I think it's doing better at the state levels than it is at the federal levels. But the other thing is this: our law students are walking out of law schools with different expectations. And one of the things the ABA just did is there's a new mandate for all the law schools that want to keep their ABA accreditation. And that means that before any student can take get involved in clinical work, okay, so like not the core classwork, but anything that's clinical or outside of that, they have to both do classwork. They have to do either as a separate course or incorporated into the courses racism and cross-cultural understanding. Both of those have to be incorporated in. So as we develop out our new law students are becoming our new associates, they're coming in with different expectations of law firm life, how they're going to live their lives, and how much they are going to conform how they appear in court. And yeah. So any questions? We've got a few minutes. I didn't do a great job last time reserving time at the end for questions, so I wanted to make sure I left time for questions. Carol, I've seen your comment that things have changed. Women could not wear pants to court when you started. Yes, I mean, I was born in 1970, particularly, it's supposed to be part of the type of women's revolution. Did not, actually work out quite as well as I thought it was going to as a kid. But you're right, if I tried to walk into court in the 80s or early 90s with blue hair, probably would not have been appreciated by the judges. But now they ask me for child tips, so I'll take it. There was I saw a good comment back up here. Was it Melanie Ross? Okay. Many women lawyers choose to leave to stay home with their kids or work part-time to be with their kids. Yes. And it's interesting because we assume culturally, right? And here's once again our lens and its amplification, that if someone is going to stay home with the kids, it's going to be the mom. I'll tell you that my girl's dad was probably better in that role than I was. I love my kids. I love my kids to death. But just in terms of we have made that choice, we could have sat down and made that choice back then. Instead of me staying home for the first couple of years, I think he would have been a little bit better at it than I was. And we need to think about both parents as being equal potential caregivers, and not just assume that it's the woman that or the one partner has to, because of history, give up their career and everything else and make that choice. And that's one of the reasons we've got this mass exodus from the law. In fact, the recent data that they're really concerned about is because of COVID. Women they're leaving big law in droves to work part-time or independently, remotely at home to stay with their kids. So trying to fix that issue with the equity partner 2% is becoming more complicated. It's added a new layer of complication. But maybe it's also a sign of even more change that's about to come. So, all right, let's see. There's a bunch of great questions. Joanne, that's a great question. Joanne's question is, how do you change the perspective of some older women in the corporate legal field to which you feel are most stuck on what is appropriate dress, speech, demeanor in the workplace? First of all, is to make sure they have a voice. So remember that three I was talking about before? You have the complainers, the critiquers, and the continuers. Get them to be a positive critiquer, okay? and get them to have a voice in the change, but make sure that there's enough people in there to sort of balance out that voice. One of the things I've actually been doing a lot in the past year is people are having a hard time finding associates for their firms. And they're like, what's the problem? And I see things, I look at their job ads and they're like, okay, they want someone with 5 years of experience that graduated in their top 2% of their law class, that's done this, that, and the other thing. And I'm like, they're 5 years out. Why do you care where they graduated in their law school? Look at what they've been recently done. So if you look at the capacity and the capabilities of the people and you focus everybody on evaluating on that, what is it I need to do my job? How do I need to appear to do my job? One thing, Joanne, I had was when I was with Morgan Lewis, we were on site with some of our clients that had large call centers. And they told us, our clients told us to dress call center level. They gave us their dress requirements. And one of the places, it was not uncommon to see people running around in practically beach gear. So we were in jeans and t-shirts as the lawyers brought in as outside counsel. And that can also be used as a way to say, hey, look, this is our client's dress codes. This is our client's expectations. And you can also point to studies that show the ability to relate to people and have good and positive information exchanges can be impacted by overly formal wear. So there are a lot of studies out there. Oh God, I've got questions over here. So the people of color phrase, when I was using that before, was the phrase that was used in the study or the article that I was pulling it from. So I tend to mirror the language that's being used in there. I do understand that the phrase people of color, women of color, is one, or by POC, is one that is not universally adopted or appreciated. I'm white and 53. I do not feel like I have the position to properly opine on that. So I'm currently mirroring the language that is in the articles that I'm reading or working from. Oh my God, Marisol, you brought up such a good, so Marisol has pointed out two really great things to me. And what's a good category for people that have fair skin but who are not white? Colorism is an issue that has been struggled with. The standard of beauty in the world was established through colonialism, honestly, as being the fair white woman. And if you look at different beauty standards in different countries, you see a lot of products that are literally designed to whiten darker skin to a more European standard. It is a centuries old, generational old issue. I do not have good answers, but it is a good question to ask. And if you have minority bar groups, small groups, to start having those discussions, my answer to you is, as a member of that group, you need to tell us. Okay, it's not for me to define you, but you guys need to tell us, and that's really important. We're hearing that out of the groups of people, minorities that deal with disabilities, are redirecting languages in ways. For example, we don't not say like things like wheelchair user, but person who uses a wheelchair, putting the emphasis on the person and minimizing and putting as a secondary characteristic the fact that they are using an assistive device. Okay. Could the ABA require implicit bias training for graduates rather than just students? Yes, but the ABA is not a national authority and cannot like impact it. It's really our individual state levels do it. Now, for example, our local judges here, if you want to get appointments in the court, you have to have a certain amount of implicit bias training. You have to put it, so for me to be appointed as a guardian ad litem or an attorney ad litem, which is the only litigation I still do, I had to show that I had an implicit bias training other than just me teaching it. So that is a change that can happen at a local level. A lot of these changes don't have to start at the top. They start at the bottom and they grow from there. So local initiatives create great change. That Air Force, the Warrior Braids, started with a small group of people and they grew it. Okay, and so I've got another question here. Are there studies on more from aware what clients expect? Yes, there are. And some of them, unfortunately, are behind paywalls or behind JSTOR, and that's a problem. I have academic access because I'm getting my master's in legal history right now. And so I've got some access to some of that, but my answer to you is go to scholar.google.com. If you find the study and you're interested in it, but it's behind a paywall, email the person who wrote the study or persons, because they'll give you a free copy, because they don't get paid when you pay the paywall. So I've almost always been able to get a free copy out there, but scholar.google.com is a great way to start looking for some of the recent studies on all of this, because it does do a good job of indexing. Okay.
I'm going to jump in real quickly because
Yes.
I'm realizing it's 1:31 and I know all these great questions were sort of coming in at the very back end. I don't know if
Okay.
Denise has a few extra moments,
I
but
do.
we do understand if people do need to hop off. But
Yeah.
there was one comment that I was going to share with the group. I'm very involved with the National Conference of Bar Presidents, and we did a panel on transitions after COVID. So if you're interested in client expectations, I saw that was the 4th or 5th question in the Q&A, that one of the last to be answered that Denise kind of answered about studies. They do have a study called Pulse of the Profession that does talk about expectations of clients, where they're much more amenable to Zoom meetings, meeting remotely, remote law firms, less of an expectation, less of even a preference to see their lawyer in the office. It's more convenient for them, and so on. So there's a lot of great data about expectations there.
Oh, I would, if you could write emails on my PowerPoint, I would love to talk to you. The more I learn, they just brought me on to South Texas College of Law as an adjunct professor in the clinical program for dispute resolution. And we're literally rewriting our program from the ground up, not only to include the cross-cultural competency and racism issues, but also to just change how we're approaching doing those very things. And so knowing about initiatives, and I'm always looking for opportunities to dovetail various initiatives to people, and also sometimes just connect people. That's, you know, one of the great privileges of when I get to talk. I almost always find a new connection that I can connect people together who are doing things and bringing change. You know, our country is changing rapidly. It changes through technology. It changes as we become, you know, more demographically diverse. And I love it. I love being in Houston and getting to experience all of that. And I just want our profession to do, to be what it should be, which is the shining star representation of our communities on every level. And I may sound naive or old school on that, but that is the reason I love being a lawyer and being an educator and doing the work that I do. So
I think that wraps up the 5th of the 5 questions. So
yeah,
I
do
don't
you
know,
have any
perhaps
other
we
questions?
should.
Okay. And as always, and as I said last time, please, if somebody has questions or comments, wants more information on something, do feel free to email me. I will tell you, because I'm normally in mediation during the day. Sometimes I'm a little slow on non-urgent emails, but I will get back to you, I promise. And I will do my best to supply the information that you're looking for. And also, some people have sent me down on some great research rabbit holes doing that too. So I always learn as well. So thank you all so very much for your time, and have a wonderful week and the happiest of holiday seasons. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Denise. Thanks, Kathleen, for all the back operational assistance, running the program smoothly. And we'll see you with the next presentation on whatever topic that might be.
Thank you.